one of the recent experiences I had, which made us think of having this as our subject, aside from the fact that it seems to make sense at this point, is that I had a call from a French, from a reporter for a French magazine or newspaper in New York, who called to find out about the situation in the US of psychoanalysis. The reason for that was that her editor asked her to write an article about psychoanalysis in America following an article in a French magazine, which is the equivalent of our Newsweek or Times, which declared on its cover back in November of 2005 that Freud was dead. So she called to ask me about Freud is dead in France, what's the situation in the US? And I told her that the New York Times declared that Freud was dead 15 years ago. So that we were familiar with this, but that I continued to practice every day and wasn't yet out of work. So, but that made me think that it would be a nice thing to try and, in an open way, discuss where psychoanalysis is and where it's going. And we have certainly the participants here who can tell us that, and I will introduce them. Jay Greenberg is a training and supervising analyst at the Alanson White Institute, and he is a former editor of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Bill Grossman is a past panelist at the Center's Roundtable on Artificial Intelligence, is a training and supervising analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and he is on the advisory board of the Philoctetes Center. Peter Loewenberg, who's sitting next to me, is the Dean and Director of Training at the New Center for Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles. He is a professor of history and political psychology at UCLA, author of Decoding the Past, the Psychohistorical Approach and Fantasy and Reality and History, in History, and he will be the Sir Peter Ustinov Professor at University of Vienna this summer. That's the actor Peter Ustinov. Yeah. Bob Michels is the Walsh McDermott University Professor of Medicine and Psychiatry. He's the former chairman of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical School, and he's the dean of that medical school. He's a training and supervising analyst at Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research. And Jerry Weiner is editor of the Annual of Psychoanalysis, professor emeritus of psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he is the former director of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. So with that, I'll just open it, and anybody who wants to start can do so. You moved your hand, so why don't you start?
I feel like I'm at an auction. This is my first experience with theater in the round, so I'm not quite sure how to read all the faces, but I have spent most of my life as a professor of psychiatry, and also at the same time I am a training and supervising analyst at the Chicago Institute, and I probably would say something provocative about the way American psychoanalysis for too long neglected people from other disciplines as far as training, and also
besides medicine.
Besides medicine, and took over American psychiatry and then got kicked out because of an elitist kind of position. Is this enough provocation?
I'd endorse that. Go ahead.
So my understanding was we were supposed to be looking at what we did wrong and what we could do better.
Right.
So we're correcting a number of these things over the past 10 or 20 years. But I think we have had trouble until recently with having our journals refer only to our 3 or 4 of our other journals. Now we refer to many fine scholarly publications, and we like to think of ourselves as a science. but most sciences refer to other sciences in their bibliographies. We still are only in the initial stages of doing that, although most of these things are on the mend. So these are some of the things that occurred to me to start the discussion.
I think in the last 50 years, psychoanalysis has really become generalized in the culture, and it is, as Auden said on Freud's death, it's become a climate of opinion. And I want to tell you just about my field, my original field in history. In 1957, William Langer gave a presidential address, and he's a very classical diplomatic historian, but it's called The Next Assignment, and he said the next assignment for historians is to learn psychoanalysis. And I was in graduate school at the time, and he said psychoanalysis would seem to have much to contribute to the solution of historical problems.
Maybe if you move that a little bit lower, it won't.
Viewed in the light of modern depth psychology, the homespun, common sense psychological interpretations of past historians, even some of the greatest, seem woefully inadequate, not to say naive. Clearly, the time has come for us to reckon with a doctrine that strikes so close to the heart of our own discipline. That was an agenda. And many of us, I was awed in graduate school, and this is going to be the future. And we were hoping for psychoanalysts in all the major social science departments of the country. Well, that did not happen. Instead, something else happened, which is even better. And I want to read to you just a few sentences from the Journal of American History. It's the one everybody gets with their membership. March 97. If you ever see it in a bookstore, buy it, because the graduate students steal them from the libraries. You can't get them. Okay. What happened, a Southern historian, a distinguished Southern historian named Joel Williamson at Chapel Hill, 40 years of researching the South, slavery, Reconstruction, etc., came out with a self-reflective article. And what he didn't see in the South, it was lynching, and why he didn't see it. It's an elegant piece about gender and sex and so on. What I want to read you from is the introduction by the editor of the Journal of American History. His name's David Thielen. And I suggest to you it could have been written on a good day by Steve Levy, but it wasn't. It's written by this historian. We live in an age when historians are as interested in doing history as in the product of that doing. We want to find out why authors say what they say and why they shun what they shun. In the best autobiographical accounts, personal experience becomes a threshold, not a destination, as authors transcend themselves and speak to us. Joel Williamson wrote about how he came to see some things while failing to see others. And his essay invited referees to respond in equally intimate and candid ways, comparing what they see as they go about their work with what Williamson saw and revealing why history matters to them. Williamson challenges us to think about what we see and do not see. It's not written by an analyst. To reflect on what in our experience we avoid, erase, or deny, as well as what we focus on. He insists that the subjects of history live inside us, and that we as a culture can talk ourselves into not recognizing and confronting dark, emotional sides of our past, preferring to leave them silent in the shadows. What looks like specialization, pace geria, what looks like specialization may be avoidance and erasure. The challenge for history is to face squarely the things that are so horrible that we try not to see or to remember them. Not to rest until we've reached the heart of darkness, especially when that heart beats within us. Besides psychological and cultural issues of avoidance and denial, lie fragmenting and isolating rhythms in the contemporary craft of historical scholarship that make it hard for us to find and converse with what we each do. Could have been written by any member of this panel or anyone in this room. It's an analytically informed, does not mention psychoanalysis, does not mention Freud, but it is part of the research and scholarly culture of the country.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment, and I think on the one hand it characterizes the way psychoanalysts have always thought about what we do with and for our patients. One of the things that, picking up also on the way Jerry framed some of the changes of the last 15 years, is that I think it's increasingly happened to us as psychoanalysts with the opening up of the discipline and with the emergence of more conversations among psychoanalysts of different persuasions, that we're put in a position not only of challenging what our patients aren't noticing, but of challenging what we're not noticing as psychoanalysts. There's a very different kind of conversation that's going on in the psychoanalytic community than went on 20, 25 years ago, when we were all talking to ourselves rather than opening up to people who were seeing psychoanalytic theory, psychoanalytic process very differently. We're living in an unalterably changed community, right? Psychoanalytic community right now. Along with some of the shrinkage that's happened, there's also an opening up to different points of view. And I think that changes how each of us in our offices thinks about ourselves, thinks about what we're doing, thinks about our work with our patients. And so one of the things that I'd like to put on the table tonight is how the sort of intramural changes within psychoanalysis have affected the nature of psychoanalytic work itself.
If I were in the audience, I think I would desperately want a map to figure out what these people are all talking about. It seems to me we've reflected the fact that the real title should be Psychoanalyses at 150 years, because the word means lots of different things. And some of the language that suggests that there might be bad news, Ed invites us to be frank, meaning he thinks there's something we may be uncomfortable saying that would not sound so good. And we talk about mistakes that have been made. Have to do with one psychoanalysis. Peter is extolling the immense success and power of another psychoanalysis. Jay's interested in our psychoanalysis, what we do all day long. And those are three different universes in some way. So we're talking about a way to treat patients. We're talking about a climate in the intellectual world that has had a powerful impact on a great many disciplines and the way they think. We're talking about a scientific community and the way it has perhaps mishandled and is learning to handle and is negotiating its boundaries with other scientific communities, and what kinds of transactions will go on, and in what ways it should and in what ways perhaps it shouldn't follow the customs of those communities and its dialogue and its discourse. We haven't talked really very much about the organizational, formal, professional aspects. People in the room would be perhaps interested, perhaps amused, perhaps dismayed to hear what goes on in the meetings of the halls of power in the psychoanalytic associations, which mostly worry about bylaws and things like that, and how they should distribute votes. And those are all different worlds. And my guess is there'd be very, very much an error to say that at 150 years, psychoanalysis deserves a B+ or a A- or a D. I think it deserves, something like 2 A's, a C, and 2 F's or something like that. And so we're going to have to split it.
Well, I'd like to again endorse Jerry's position that the whole world today is interdisciplinary, not just in science fields where they all say we have to. I mean, it's amusing to watch how departments of psychiatry, used to be departments of psychiatry, now they're bio, psycho, social, etc. long name trying to subsume everything in it. And the hot button words are things like culture, gender, ethnicity, and so on. And it's not just in the sciences. Hard time, engineering. We don't know enough. We have to get together with the chemists and the physicists and so on. The whole world is that way except psychoanalysis. And I don't want to be in the position, I mean, I wouldn't like it if you guys came out west and said, no, this is the way you ought to be doing it out in California. But there's a problem in New York with formal psychoanalytic training that it's limited to MDs in both the New York and the Columbia Institute, and it fills me with mourning. One of the
You think there's something wrong with us just because we won't let you in, Peter?
Yeah, I do. I have some documents. I'm a historian, and I'd like to acknowledge that
Your historical information is wrong. New York Psychoanalytic has been admitting non-MDs for many years.
And Columbia.
And Columbia has.
And NYU.
When did you admit the last research person in New York? I understood the board
Recently.
abolished it.
No.
Oh, actually,
no.
they don't have to be research people to get admitted now. So, yeah, the debate is now about social workers.
Here's I hope the debate gets resolved positively. Here's a classic article from the New Yorker about Franz Boas. Franz Boas of Columbia. And you know the names of his students: Benedict, Mead, some of them, Zoe Hurston, who started measuring cephalic indexes in Harlem, Claude Lévi-Strauss, etc. Cardiner. They were closely identified with analysis, and they used it. I mean, everybody in this room's read Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, and how she used the analysis of her day, and talked about the Arapesh and so on. So today, I mean, we've trained the chair of anthropology at UCLA, and the immediate past chair, but you guys are isolated, and I want to acknowledge, I mean, I know the people in residency training at SC, and I do PGY 3 and 4 at UCLA. They say the Columbia residents really come out knowing psychodynamics. They're really well trained, maybe the best in the country. That's great, but there is really so much more that you could be bringing in. A great English department at Columbia. Where are they? And I have a.
I think your microphone has fallen.
It has no meaning. Don't worry about it, Peter.
Peter is an old friend, but I have to say the term biopsychosocial model, which was coined by an analyst, George Engel, who was an internist, trained in Chicago, and commuted to Chicago, and I don't think he ever took a psychiatric residency. But I think his effort was to incorporate within medicine, at least where I started off my remarks, these other forces. And I think in a way you're proving a point that you're arguing against by someone, that particular term, although that's a narrow base of data. I think one of the problems about psychoanalysis, is this a treatment? We'll talk about is this a treatment, or is this a mind expansion in a good sense of the word? I tell people I have a subspecialty. My subspecialty is human suffering. And I don't always treat them as a patient, but hopefully let them know more about what kicks them around from inside, so they're in the driver's seat a bit more in their lives. That doesn't get rid of all suffering, and Freud said, well, just go back to ordinary unhappiness if we get rid of neurotic suffering. But I think the expanding of not only who our students are, who our colleagues are, but how about who our patients are. And we are still elitist largely in that respect. We are not very good about opening clinics, except for training purposes. We are not very good at donating our services in some way or in teaching. Many of us do, and I'm not saying we're, but I think there's an area for expansion. It's not only those whom we take in as colleagues and students, but how about the using of psychoanalytic principles, which I like to teach to my residents, who are among the most anti-psychoanalytic folks by the time they get to me, and to unlearn some of that stuff and help them understand that don't write a prescription within the first 15 minutes of meeting someone, things of this sort, and to expand the kind of ideas we have to apply psychoanalysis in treatment circumstances that are beyond the classic rendering of 4 times a week.
Peter's proselytizing and Jerry's response to me opens up one of the fundamental tensions among the various psychoanalyses, and it's one that's been in the field from close to the beginning. Ignoring the history for a moment, one psychoanalysis is a form of treatment for sick people. It's a profession of caretakers. Its sister professions would be surgery and medicine and pediatrics. And very, very important in the selection and training and graduation and licensing and certification. The most important would be to make sure that the patients are protected, get good treatment, and don't get harmed by poorly done treatment, like other helping professions. That's one psychoanalysis. Another psychoanalysis is an incredibly valuable, rich, and important area of human knowledge, which has a unique, immensely valuable perspective on how to look at and understand all types of human activity. It's very, very closely linked to history, to sociology, to political science, to economics, and to many of the humanities. The most terrible thing that could happen to that field is if irrational restrictions on who were to have access to this body of knowledge or who were to learn how to use it would restrict the creative people who might make important contributions. In the first psychoanalysis, the worst error you can make is to let someone in who might be of sub-threshold quality as a person, ethically, responsibly, clinically meticulous. In the second psychoanalysis, the worst mistake you make would be to keep somebody out who, although they're maverick and different and odd and strange, are creative and intelligent and potentially gifted. But they're the same field. And the tensions between those two meanings of psychoanalysis and those two missions of our educational programs are coming through in your polemic about and it's no surprise to someone who knows the United States that there's a difference between California and New York on that particular issue.
Well, I think there's another side of that question, because one is a kind of personnel question of who we train and what the disciplinary and personal criteria for both admission to training and graduation from training should be. I think what's of more interest, to me at least, is the relationship that psychoanalysis has to these other disciplines, and whether we see ourselves simply as training people who have their background in other disciplines, or whether we can see ourselves as learning from people who have their backgrounds in other disciplines. And I think one of the problems that psychoanalysis has gotten into since Freud, and one of the ways in which he set us off in a direction that's been harmful to us, is that he thought that because psychoanalysis owned the unconscious, that we owned the deepest explanatory method that could get to the bottom of problems that people in other disciplines had been working on for millennia in many cases. So that, for example, in his use of the Oedipus story and Sophocles' Oedipus play was brilliant and certainly changed the world. But on the other hand, it also disenfranchised psychoanalysis from many of the people who knew most about the myths and the tragedies, because he claimed that he had conceptual tools that explained something that convinced nobody who had spent their lives, or very few people, I should say, who spent their lives studying those myths and those, and wound up, despite the brilliant use he was able to make of the Oedipus complex, disenfranchising psychoanalysis from a lot of people who had a lot to teach us. And I think that we continue to isolate ourselves. In that sense, by the way, Philoctetes comes to mind as a model, because Philoctetes was both despised by and needed by society, but he gloried in his isolation, and he gloried in his rejection, and his isolation was a splendid badge of courage for him, even though he was promised admission back to society and heroic status and cure of his illness should he accept the offer. But he continued to refuse the offer until the Deus Ex Machina came along and sort of forced the issue. But I think that psychoanalysis has gloried in its isolation for 100 years. And at the same time as we turn around and say, why do they despise us?
And it's a dangerous isolation. Now, I want to address this point of clinical excellence. You know, I don't think that's what's at stake. I think it's a medical subculture. I've analyzed people who enter training, and what's very important to them in putting together a new class is, are there going to be some other physicians in there? Are there going to be my people? From explicis verbis, I mean, this is the way they talk about, from the medical background. But it's no guarantee of clinical excellence, just as some kind of training in humanities is an assurance that you won't have it.
But the professional question isn't, can you guarantee excellence? It's, what's the maximum assurance of not being below a certain line? Well, it's a different question.
I think it's a clinical subculture that they feel comfortable with, and they get a lot of reassurance. And we want psychiatrists. We go way out of our way to get them. But that's really what they're looking for. And I want to advance a position based on what Franz Boas did in the teens and 20s, which was he took on eugenics. He went down to Washington and testified against the American immigration laws of 1921, 1924, which were racially and ethnically exclusionary of Southern and Eastern Europeans and so on. And he said, adaptation and culture will change people. And you can get these little Sicilians and you bring them to North America and so on, and you get Justice Alito, you know, and so on. Now,
wait a minute, which side are you arguing, Peter?
And I want to advance that there are people you're interested in the biological interplay who are advancing the same argument that environment influences the brain. There's Gerald Edelman. There's Eric Kandel.
Many.
And many others. And the isolation was demonstrated to me just this week. A former provost of Columbia University is having an event, big event on 26th February. I can't go because I'll be back in Los Angeles. And I happen to have the list of people invited, and I looked through for an analyst. And I saw Eric Kandel, and I said, he must be at least an honorary member. Well, he's not even an honorary member. I called Dean Stein down at the American, and so he writes me, why don't you consider nominating Kandel for honorary membership? Malcolm Oatman is the chair of the honorary membership committee. This came back on the 12th of February. Well, I figure it's not my job, but how come Columbia's never, offered people in his lab psychoanalytic training, reached out. We gave Gerald Eldman of California an honorary membership in the American. I mean, this is a very fancy A-list of people going, Barbara Epstein of the New York Review of Books, Ash Green of Random House, etc., and all the academics from Columbia. There are no analysts in there. And it wasn't Eric Kandel. He'll be there, but he's...
I think Bill wants to say something.
Well, I think that this discussion is an illustration of where psychoanalysis is today. Because, and I'm serious, I agree with what Jay has to say and what Bob has to say, because it seems to me that we have to make certain kinds of distinctions. And one is, where is the profession that calls itself psychoanalysis today? And we have to distinguish that from, and that's about changes and so on. But also, what are the goals of the profession? There are many questions about a profession, including the goals and how you decide who's promoting those goals and whatnot. And there are a lot of things you could say about that politically, that is internal politics, politics in relation to other institutions, and things of that kind. And it's also partly a sociological question. But I think that there is a core issue, and I think Jay was touching on it. I don't happen to agree with what he says about Freudian analysis, but that I think is an important piece of what's going on in the field, that people differ on that issue. And that means that they also differ on what they're considering to be psychoanalysis, not only as a profession, but as a system of ideas, or systems of ideas, which is one of the issues. But this is a different problem from the problem. Now, it's not unrelated, I might add, because we are affected by other fields. And I think that the women's movement and the attitudes toward sexuality are really one of the most dramatic examples of what happened to thinking in the field as a result of social movements. But I thought, it'd be interesting if I can read just 2 quotes from Freud, because of the way he defined, that's where I agree with Bob, that we are into a problem of what are we talking about when we talk about psychoanalysis? How do we define it? What field of activity within the profession are we referring to? So Freud said in 1914, although it is a long time now since I was the only psychoanalyst, I consider myself justified in maintaining that even today, no one can know better than I do what psychoanalysis is, how it differs from other ways of investigating the life of the mind, and precisely what should be called psychoanalysis, and what would better be described by some other name. And it seems important to me that for him, aside from whatever you might say about the authoritarian stance, which is, sort of obvious, but the thing is that he thought of it as a way of investigating the life of the mind. And and then he went on a number of years later to state what he thought were the cornerstones of psychoanalytic theory. He said, the assumption that there are unconscious mental processes, the recognition of the theory of resistance and repression, the appreciation of the importance of sexuality and of the Oedipus complex, these constitute the principal subject matter of psychoanalysis and the foundations of its theory. No one who cannot accept them all should count himself a psychoanalyst. Now, if we look around us today, considering analysis from the point of view of ideas, most people who call themselves analysts today do not subscribe to any of these cornerstones. even if they adhere to an idea of the unconscious, it's not the unconscious Freud had in mind. So I think this is very important, because the further development of the part that interests me most, which is the development of analytic thought, has to do with variations and responses to this definition. And that Freud really had, in my view, a very broad view of things. I mean, if you ever take the trouble to look through his writings for what he had to say on interdisciplinary studies, turns out that this is a major part of his thinking. And that not only that, but that he was quite brilliant in his perception that there's a great difficulty to interdisciplinary studies because the two fields in question don't know each other's subject matter well enough. And he said, the best we can hope for is a dialogue. Well, that sounds pretty good to me. That Freud, the professional psychoanalyst and authority, may have behaved in all kinds of peculiar ways in relation to these ideas, isolating himself, taking an authoritarian position, things of that kind. That's interesting from the sociology of the development of knowledge. But there are still issues around this that have to do with analytic thinking and from a conceptual view, why the field has fragmented intellectually in the way that it has.
Bill's raising central, we're switching to something that feels easier to get one's teeth into, which is fun. We can go back. But Bill's, to me, raising a central issue, but he's cagey, because he starts by telling us that, yeah, Freud was authoritarian, and we may not like his style in announcing that it's up to him what psychoanalysis is, but then goes on nonetheless to quote Freud and say, and that's what it is. It's what Freud said it was 60 years ago or 80 years ago.
More than that.
80 years ago.
Over.
And he can't understand why so many people call themselves analysts who don't agree that that's what it is. And of course, the answer is they don't agree with Freud's definition of what's essential. They think that it's possible that 100 years after he said it, we might discover he was wrong, and that he may have, like many people do, failed to realize what was the essential discovery, taking their findings as the essence of the discipline, rather than the method that led to those findings. So there are analysts today who would call themselves analysts and would belong to the same club Bill belongs to and pay dues to the same treasury, who would say the essence of analysis is not infantile sexuality or transference or resistance, but it's the use of the therapeutic process to discover things about the mind and about the therapeutic relationship. And that any discoveries made by that method are psychoanalytic discoveries, even if they contradict what Freud discovered by that method. And so Bill, to name names so we can get a fight going, he's sitting next to the former director of the Chicago Institute. Bill would have to say Cohen wasn't really an analyst by his definition.
Since my definition, it's Freud's.
Right, but it's not psychoanalysis' definition, because psychoanalysis is no longer, a half a century after his death or more, defined by what Freud said in 1914.
That's my point.
In one of Freud's definitions, in the definition from 1914, in the same paper that you quoted,
I quoted.
He talked about transference and resistance.
Sure.
And he said that I think very much along the lines of what Bob is saying, he said that any method of inquiry that uses the concepts of transference and resistance is psychoanalysis. And then he adds, regardless of the conclusions, of the findings which it comes up with. Infantile sexuality, the Oedipus complex as Freud defined it, etc., is in that sense a finding of psychoanalytic inquiry, and transference and resistance can be thought of much along the lines of the way Bob is talking about as methodological assumptions. so that Freud himself can be quoted.
Of course.
Freud was famous for his shibboleths, and there are many shibboleths at various points in his. I think that the particular definition that you used is one of the narrower, more content-oriented definitions, and I think that in today's pluralistic world, there is much more of an assumption of the methodological definition of psychoanalysis.
Well, I mean, that was actually the point of my comments. I'm not presenting this as an indication of my own position, but rather to bring out this very fact that the nature of the aims, the nature of the conceptions, the nature of the central foci of analysis, what is meant by analysis, in other words, has changed radically. But it hasn't changed to something else, it's changed to many things else. And so the whole question of how those things are related to the methods by which, or the methods by which they derive their, you might say their data, but I would prefer to say what they use as their exemplars of what they're talking about. See, because it often isn't really data, it's a particular way of formulating something that is based on experience, but reflects much more than that in the way it selects material. So my point is that this subject and the ways in which these ostensible fundamental aims, that's why I emphasized his idea that this is a way of studying the mind. That was his goal. But that's not the goal of many people today. That's, I think, is subsumed under the designation of one-person psychology, for instance, as though studying the mind would not entail studying environmental influences and the way the mind is, as it were, as Freud often described it, floating in a sea of environmental influence or biological influence. And I'm really arguing for two things. One is an attention to the complexity of the system Freud created and the way in which subsequent developments in thinking have selected elements from that complexity in order to make them a new center for thinking about what then are determined to be the goals of psychoanalytic work. And I think that's where the intellectual struggles today are organized.
Bill, I wish you had quoted Freud on the ideal psychoanalytic education.
Yeah, well, I mean,
he said, an analyst will not understand his patient unless he knows the history of civilization, knows a lot about religion, is well educated in religion and mythology and so on.
Right. This is the point, that that it's, you know, and I understand what you're talking about, Jay. It's like you can always find a quote for this or that. But that isn't the point. What I'm really talking about is taking a view of it that integrates, where Freud didn't, ideas of a certain kind of exploration of the mind or analysis as a way of studying it, and the place of all these other modes of thought in the construction of that whole thing.
To me, this links to our earlier discussion and to Jerry's opening comment. Jerry was talking about the history of psychoanalysis in the United States in his opening comment, and saying that we went awry, but there's some sign that we may be back on track and things are getting better. My own construction of the history would be that Freud starts out with a brilliant set of ideas and hypotheses and conjectures, and there's no question what psychoanalysis is up till his death. It's whatever he says it is. He owns, as he says in the history of the psychoanalytic movement, the opening sentence you quoted, it's up to me what psychoanalysis is. I own the word.
And nobody listened.
Oh, some people listened.
Some people did.
The day after he published that paper, Jung and friends quit the International Psychoanalytic Association. They must have read it.
Right.
But what happens after his death, and sort of vaguely between then and now, is we move from a single specific concept defined by an authority to, and then we have a multiple choice. Jerry thinks we're moving toward a more academic discourse in which competing alternative concepts will enter some type of process in which we can make judgments and select, reject, refine, and further advance. Some others would say we're moving toward chaos, in which anything goes, and anyone who announces they have a psychoanalytic idea can publish it in the Psychoanalytic Journal and be a psychoanalyst. I'll finish in about 10 minutes, Jerry. You're not in a hurry. There's an underlying issue, which is why hasn't our discipline developed the structures and the setting for the dialogue that would make sure we move in the first direction, not the second? To me, the answer is very apparent, and it goes back to Freud again, because for complicated historical reasons, we've largely avoided universities, and we've insisted on being in business for ourselves in freestanding institutions, the vast majority of the participants in which were full-time practitioners of psychoanalysis. Buildings like this, with people like the ones who come here, have constructed the profession. And the sociology of such a group doesn't lead to the resolution of conflict. And so Peter was proselytizing before about why we don't do all kinds of things in New York that they wonderfully do in California. But one of the things they haven't done in California is form tight linkages to universities that will embed their psychoanalytic institutes in the academic settings that assure academic values penetrate the psychoanalytic dialogue.
But what are the gains that have been achieved in the institutes that have been part of universities that have contributed to psychoanalysis and its development, that are specifically understandable as caused by the fact that those were university?
I would say that a truly honest reply would say there's never been such an institute in the United States. There have been some that have picked up the trappings and camouflage, but there's never really been one. There have probably been some closer to it in Europe than in the United States, but not even there.
I'd like to answer this. We haven't embedded the institutes in the university, but it's like the difference between William Langer and Thielen. We have trained in the major social science and humanistic departments analysts, so that I just mentioned we have the two anthropologists. One of these days you're going to hear from one of our sociologists who's scheduled to come and talk to this group about nationalism.
And when you
Jeffrey
were selected
Prager.
as dean, what members of other disciplines were on the search committee that selected you, Peter? What
Psychologists?
What non-analysts from the broader academic world?
See, I think the question is, yes, we can train people from other disciplines, but we're training them. Can they train us?
Well, they teach on our faculty, and the important thing is having a critical mass in a university so that they can help each other out when they run into a lot of hostility, because psychoanalysis does not have flash, it does not have currency in the university, but it helps in promotions to help others.
I keep having the association to a guy I met in high school or college, I think, who was studying to be a Catholic priest. And he told me essentially that the reason that I wasn't Catholic and didn't understand that he was right was because I hadn't devoted 10 years to studying Thomas Aquinas. And if I did, I would then, of course, agree with him. It was an interesting
was an offer you couldn't refuse.
So, your point is very well taken. I thought Jay was approaching this several minutes ago. University departments in a medical school often have the chair of the search committee might be, for a psychiatry department, might be a surgeon, et cetera, and there are other people around. We have, at times, and this is what I was referring to about publishing our psychobiographies and our applied psychoanalytic studies in our own journals, and often neglecting, except for a biography or two which we cite, the scholarship in the area that we're trying to write about. And that is getting a little better, too, but it's the sense that I've read Thomas Aquinas for 10 years, so therefore I'm an analyst, and what I have to say is gained by analytic knowledge, and you haven't studied for 10 years, so you have no right to disagree with me.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's been a very prevalent attitude, and a very people who have studied other related authors for an equally long amount of time turn out to be remarkably unconvinced by our protestations that they haven't either done analysis or been in analysis, that they don't understand what we're up to. And this was an argument of Freud's from the beginning, I'm afraid. You know, you can't, unless you've experienced it, you can't understand it. And unless you can understand it, I can't have a conversation with you about it. And I think that that's been problematic. And I think that the concept of the particular way that Freud wielded the concept of the unconscious as an explanatory system, so that only somebody who understood the unconscious could explain not only the findings of other disciplines, but why people in other disciplines would believe those findings, I think was a very problematic way of trying to engage people who saw themselves as serious students of human condition.
Thank you. I don't want to be mistaken, by the way, to think that the 10 or 20 or 50 years I've been studying psychoanalysis isn't wonderfully instructive and illuminating when I'm in my consulting room working with patients. That's as Bob split the two somewhat earlier there, and that's the kind of we want to make sure someone primum noli nocere, first will do no harm, regardless of what discipline that person comes from. But when we start talking about what the world knows in general, or what other fields have, that's where I think we've gotten into tremendous trouble. And I love to read Freud for fun. I mean, there's really a tremendous amount of wisdom there, as well as technical matters.
The problem in psychoanalysis is that its therapeutic base has been attacked. What we have been training people to do has been to become healers, and that's been, when they say Freud is dead, what they mean is psychoanalysts shouldn't be practicing psychoanalysis anymore because psychoanalysis is dead, that this method of treatment is no longer valid. And so how are we going to address in the future this particular dilemma?
When we talk about broadening the scope, I'm thinking of Ludwig Binswanger, Freud's good friend, Ludwig Binswanger's approach that an analyst has to deal with the Umwelt of the patient, the whole world that they live in, and the immediate primary objects. They have the Mitwelt, their family, peers, work group, etc., and then the Eigenwelt, the inner world. Has to deal with all three. And I think most of us try to do that, but that means precisely what Freud was talking about in structuring an education that includes those things.
I just want to say that when I said I didn't say what you were suggesting, that my comment had to do with the fact that people do make observations, but they cast them in a certain way. And that has to do with a number of things, you know, about their point of view. And that, as Bob suggested, if I understand him right, that really the issue, this is the opening of a discussion about the relationship of how things are observed and how they are discussed. And that's the basis for a discussion among psychoanalysts of different perceptions.
I wonder, though, Ed's question seems to be about psychoanalysis dead in a number of areas, maybe not in Upper West Side and some others.
Or Upper East Side.
Upper East Side. But there are a number of places around the country, and around, from what I understand from my friends in the international, it's true international. that there's a great decline and difficulty in finding patients. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people. And Freud said something about sometime the gold of psychoanalysis has to be alloyed with the copper of psychotherapy. I think that sometime bronze is even tougher. And I don't mean that we call it psychoanalysis when we help develop other treatments, or we find a treatment to fit the patient. Not the idea that if somebody's in psychoanalysis, they're getting the best. It's not often the best. And that we are not, I've said this a little bit earlier, we have not done enough to encourage, and now I'm talking therapeutically, Peter, not about the other area of psychoanalysis as the body of knowledge. We're not doing enough to make what our gold available in ways that are usable. For example, I wrote a paper about the psychodynamic aspects of prescribing medication. Something that I do regularly. I prescribe medication at least once every 2 years. So, but I wrote this paper because I think it's very important that people who are doing a lot of that have some sense of what the patient's saying when they're coming in and talking about the side effects, and that has a relevance for the prescriber, not just the pill. And this is one area. There are a number of areas we could explore, and many of people are in these areas, but and improving psychotherapy skills, or knowing those cases that we should refer on to other kinds of therapists.
But I don't understand how, I mean, are you saying the future of psychoanalysis is in being able to prescribe more medication and having more psychotherapy?
No,
how do we deal with the problem?
No, I didn't mean that. I meant help teach people that when you teach a general psychiatrist how to do this better, and he begins to appreciate some of the things that we have to offer, A, he may start referring people to us, or B, he may come him or herself to see us.
Complicated. Ed wants us to talk about the therapeutic value of psychoanalysis. And I think Jerry's arguing that in addition to psychoanalysis, the impact of the ideas goes far beyond the practice of what most people today would call psychoanalysis. So many, many, many more patients are influenced by psychoanalytic ideas because of their impact on general psychiatry, psychotherapy, etc. And most of the popular empirically based specific therapies are derivative of psychoanalysis, CBT, IPT, etc. There's another thing that's often lost, which is if you look at what Freud did from the beginning till the 1920s, it's much more like contemporary psychotherapy than contemporary psychoanalysis. You wouldn't recognize what we call psychoanalysis today until the 30s. It rarely went beyond a year. The goals were very focused. The aim of therapy was not character, but symptom relief or specific focal changes. We're talking about what was psychoanalysis at the time that Freud wrote his clinical papers would today be considered dynamic psychotherapy. What psychoanalysis today didn't exist then. There is absolutely no convincing data that it helps people. But that's true of most treatments. There is another way to say it is, the data that psychoanalysis is therapeutically useful is roughly equivalent to the data that most other treatments used in psychiatry, and for that matter, medicine, are therapeutically useful. We know about components of it. Its popularity or lack of popularity have much more to do with socioeconomic issues than with efficacy. If you don't look at it from the point of view of analysts who are worried about filling their hours, but from the point of view of patients who want help, there are more people in analysis today than there ever have been.
Exactly.
I'm not sure that the analogy I was trying to advance, that just as Boaz and his wonderful team at Columbia demonstrated that changing the environment, adaptation to the environment, affects the body, today Edelman and Kandel have shown that every experience that the person has, including psychoanalysis, affects the brain.
The person or the sea slug?
The person. What are you?
The person or the what?
Sea slug.
slug.
Sea slug.
That's what Kendall works
Kandel's
with.
research.
What else would you expect? You immerse
Just
someone in
because
a...
you cited a reference,
One.
it's really about sea slugs.
That's the way you begin. You know? And I think some modesty about what we have and the willingness to reassess is important. A little passage of Albert Camus struck me.
You got props.
I have evidence. These are documents. I'm a historian. We work with documents. He was a editor of Combat. He was a journalist, but we all know he was much more than a journalist. And I think he's talking about Freud. I think Freud would have subscribed to this. He says, a journalist who rereads his published article and does not ask whether he was right or wrong, who experiences no pangs of doubt or scruples, and who on some nights does not despair of being equal to the absurd but necessary work that he does week in and week out, analyst. In short, a journalist who does not judge himself daily is not worthy of this profession and bears the heaviest of responsibilities in his own eyes and in the eyes of his country. And that's a stance for an analyst, and it was Freud's stance who changed his theories as he went along. And we shouldn't be so dead certain that we've got the truth.
Well, I think to some extent we make a poor case for ourselves because of the isolation that we impose on ourselves, and also because of the sectarian disputes that we get into. So we have a very hard time communicating what we do. And I think it gets back to some of these definitional issues that we've been talking about. What is it that we do that's different than what other therapists do? What is it that we do that's similar? And how do we think it helps? We make a bad case for it because we get very bogged down in which one of us is actually doing psychoanalysis. And so we are at the same moment sort of promoting our claims that what our particular group is doing is beneficial, and trying to dismiss the claims of that what another group that considers themselves psychoanalysts are doing is beneficial. And that does not make us look good. The narcissism of minor differences, I think, very much interferes with our ability to create a sense that everybody in this room, I suspect, so irrespective of what might be doctrinal differences that are quite extreme, agree that the systematic exploration of meanings in our lives is a good thing. It is useful to people who suffer in their lives. I think we all agree on that. Not that many people in the society at large agree with that. We're a somewhat peculiar group in that respect, that we believe that this sort of interest in the meaning of the events and experiences of our lives has a therapeutic benefit, enhances the quality of life. Regardless of what particular aspect of that of meaning we focus on, regardless of what we think is primary and what's derivative, regardless of how we think that the particular engagement with another person might be most effective. We all agree on this very broad principle that sets us apart from the society at large. And because we get bogged down in our own minor differences, we make a very poor case to that society at large that we're onto something.
It isn't just a question of sort of society pronouncing that Freud is dead, but that within the psychoanalytic community, the self-critique has reached a very high high volume. And that's true across the schools and across the interests that we see in the panel discussion, and also even within almost every group of practitioners, where the epistemological self-doubts and critique is carried on, I think, in America, much more than it would be, as far as I know, in other psychoanalytic communities, whatever society may pronounce about their analytic communities. I don't think they're involved within themselves so much as we are in wondering, how do we know what we know? Why do we think we're right? What is the relationship between what I think about the patient and my sources of information and my own prejudices, etc. And although it isn't necessarily, in fact, it isn't my own predilection, it seems to me that there's some reflection in this discussion of what I hear as, most often in discussions, which is that the start of the discussion is, where did we go wrong? Why, what caused our downfall or something? What wrong turn did we take? As I say, it's not my belief, but it does seem to me that this is sort of like assumed often in discussions among analysts that they have to diagnose what the mistake was, and you'll hear the mistake will be, as we heard today, that Freud set up an authoritarian tradition, or that analysis hived itself off from the general community, or from universities, or from other disciplines. Somewhere along the line, we took a wrong turn. I think that, I'm not saying that's true. I think that, but I think that's characteristic of American psychiatry at this point, American psychoanalysis at this point of time, that's characteristic of America. Where did we go wrong? There's one other comment I want to make. Beside the formulas that Freud mentioned that define psychoanalysis, there was, and when there's reference to procedure, there was a procedure set out very early. That is, I think, characteristic, at least in the terms of debate now, and that was formulated early in the papers on technique. And those principles are the principles that would be considered, I think, they were not principles of general psychotherapy. If, as Bob said, earlier analysis was not doing analysis as was later conceived, that may be true, but the principles that were set out at the beginning, by 1914, were the principles that had defined psychoanalysis until very recently, and they are, all of them, the principles that are debated now, that is, very specifically within the analytic community in America. Almost every one of them is a term of debate. So there is a kind of a tradition of what to worry about, you might say. Maybe not what to do, but what to worry about, whether it's right or wrong. There is a tradition of treatment that is set out very clearly and very briefly in those early papers. But I would say that it's remarkable how the premise that something went wrong is accepted as a given.
Just a simple point about psychoanalysis in the university. It was mentioned that psychoanalysts have isolated themselves in institutes. I think there's simply another reason they're not welcome in the university. It has to do with Freud's remarks on the humanities, what he said about philosophy, what he said about religion. Okay? Behind his authoritarianism, as it was called, I see a self-privileging and a privileging of psychoanalysis as the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone that can solve all the problems. And that shows a certain amount of contempt for other ways of interpretation of finding meanings, at least as I see it, and as I think a lot of people in the university see it. Also, when you think of Freud's remarks about important social movements in his day, Marxism and feminism, which he talks about in the new introductory lectures, they're in some way rather naive and dismissive, and foolish, frankly. Or when you think his remark about the aesthetic premium and dismissing it as a kind of foreplay to getting at the content. He really doesn't get what the art's about. So Freud said a lot of things about humanities which are very dismissive. And to mention Binswanger, there's a letter between Binswanger and Freud, an exchange, and Freud says to Binswanger, I have plenty of room in my basement for your sublime types. You know that letter. And that suggests that Freud didn't really understand very much, in my opinion, what happens when you move, let's say, to the adult level, and you've made all your differentiations of self and object, and you're producing culture. And I would say one other thing to Peter. I don't think psychoanalysis is a climate of opinion anymore. I think it's dissipating. I think certain ideas have been assimilated into the popular culture, like the unconscious, for example, certain notions about object relations. I think the issue that is now of interest is the cultural context in which psychoanalysis arose, the socio-cultural context. And this is what interests various academics, sociologists. It's almost as though the sociology of psychoanalysis, starting with this monolithic figure Freud, and then think about all the early conflicts with him, and then now the pluralism, that's almost of more interest than any particular theory.
The rest of that letter, Binswanger was invited to give a talk on Freud's 80th birthday, together with Thomas Mann. And so Freud writes him, if I had another life to live, I would go with you up in the superstructure, but so far I've worked in the cellar and the basement.
Yes, but he seemed to prefer living in the cellar, and I'm not sure that he realized there were other structures quite above the cellar, that other things were happening and that were not always infantile based.
I'm also very happy to hear the name of Binswanger come up in this discussion, because I think that Freud always affected in certain kinds of relationships not to be interested in art. He does that with Binswanger. He does that also with Andre Breton, so important in the development of surrealism. And what is interesting is that none of these people was in any way put off by what they felt the gift of psychoanalysis to the understanding of the aesthetic dimension. So I don't think that would be the way I would put it at all. It strikes me that in the discussion here there are these three aspects, and it's not to do with particular statements of Freud, as the gentleman said, we can all play the game of bringing up quotes. That's not it. There's a question of the sociology of knowledge. What does it mean that Freud is a founder? And here I would make the parallel again with Andre Breton as the founder of the surrealist movement. What does it mean that a certain figure is the figure who is going to guarantee the identity of a certain activity? An activity which is humanistic activity, which also has claims to being scientific. So what does it mean that the creator of that discipline, of that activity, is there and at the same time is the guarantor of authenticity? And then there is the fact also of which Freud was absolutely cognizant, and I think this is where we can make comparisons with, say, the various French schools of analysis, not only obviously the Lacanian, but the APF, the Association Psychoanalytique de France, who produced, I think, the most brilliant scholars of the history of psychoanalysis here, which is that Freud was acutely conscious of the tension between the metapsychology and psychotherapy. Acutely conscious. And it strikes me that the whole of this discussion moves between the sociology of knowledge, on the one hand, and then the tension between metapsychology, which is a form of knowledge, and psychotherapy, which is a form of cure. And there are moments, it seems perfectly clear, that Freud would be willing to give up the psychotherapy in order to secure a certain kind of knowledge. And that it's that tension, which, if that tension belongs to the constitutive moment of the foundation of psychoanalysis, then it is not a tension from which psychoanalysis can escape. So the very pluralism that the gentleman here brings up, the very pluralism is itself a function of the way in which, in terms of the sociology of knowledge, psychoanalysis is founded, and then its knowledge is transmitted. So that in fact, there is no escaping this dilemma. And this is where I absolutely agree with you. There is much that is going on today
that Freud would not have recognized. But there's nothing that is going on today that was not envisaged within the split structure that Freud bequeathed us. So it's, I think, the sociology of knowledge and the tension between the metapsychology and psychotherapy, that is the historical dimension of the knowledge that we call analytic experience.
Thank you. Could you just give your name and say who you are, because Peter would like to know.
Michael Stone Richards, and I'm particularly interested in the sort of the school that comes after Lacan, who are also historians of psychoanalysis as well as practitioners.
I think psychoanalysis, God, I can't talk, is a very unique system of thinking and a very unique system of treatment. I think what differentiates it from every other treatment and every other thought is the awareness, the emphasis on the unconscious, on unconscious motivation, and that's it. That is the main aspect, whether you say it's sexual unconscious or narcissistic unconscious or object relation unconscious, but it is the unconscious motivation that is just different from everything else.
What if there's something which is essentially different and special about the nature of unconscious mental processes? Not to say that analysts are always right or that they agree about what those are, but what if some grasp of the nature of the way unconscious mental processes are perceived, misperceived, defended against, and so on, are not open to logical examination by people who don't have intimate experience with them? How do we bridge that gap, which has always been a troublesome one? For instance, for those of you who advocate that we should be more involved with academia, how do we bridge that gap?
I've got an answer.
And then you, and then Bill. We have two answers, and then we have three answers.
Who I agree with, like she analyzes anthropologists. The answer, and it's squarely in the province of psychoanalysis, is transference and countertransference. They have to go out and do field work, which means they have to go out and relate to various third world, so we no longer say primitive, but less developed, and they have profound experiences, which they publish. Marjorie Shostak, Nana, the lady who works with the Inuit, whose name doesn't come to mind right now, Jean, anyway, who works with the Inuit and has her powerful transferences about aggression in a society that doesn't permit any aggression and so on. And every researcher brings his or her countertransferences to the research. We're training, I mean, you think anthropology is a hard social science. We're training an economist, and that's the hardest of the social sciences. And she gave a paper in the American about John Maynard Keynes. She gave one just now in January on Adam Smith. And you know, all of these people are human beings with everything you'd expect. And just to go from there to this contribution about Freud in World War I, it's the deepest part of his self-analysis. Yes, in the first days of the war, he said, I'm giving this old Austro-Hungarian Empire another chance, and I'm a patriot. It lasted about a month. And then he's writing to Karl Abraham, I have serious doubts. And by the fall, he's writing to Van Eden in Holland. You know, we see what a terrible situation. Governments lie, and so on. And you have three parallel texts at that time. You have Mourning and Melancholia, Thoughts for the Times of War and Death, and he kept his interpretation of dreams up to date. And you have Dreams from World War I, where suddenly he's in the pantry. It's a very famous dream, which he used a couple of times. And there's his son with the head bandaged, and he's reaching for something, and he doesn't answer him. Who doesn't answer? The dead don't answer. His son is in the service, as was his other son and his son-in-law and so on. And the analysis, the associations by Sigmund Freud are, this was an envy of the young, which I thought I had long overcome, so on. So you get the contra Oedipus, you get the parental side, the King Laius, and it's a very profound development in the war, and where you get a real question about Western civilization. And on this, I'd say, clinically rooted in psychoanalysis is a subversive comment, a subversive critique of the assumptions of our civilization about love, marriage, aggression, politeness, politesse, etc.
Bill. Yeah, I just wanted to write a little footnote to what Sandy said about the possibility that it's really necessary to have a lot of experience with analysis in order to comment on it. Would we say there are other fields in which the people don't say, you're not in a position to criticize my stuff if you don't know my methods? Do we expect, don't they expect, for instance, like anthropologists, don't they expect that if we don't know how they do their field work, what we have to say about intercultural interactions, don't they take the attitude that we don't know what we're talking about? I think that's true in every field. So it's particularly offensive in psychoanalysis because everybody believes that he's had a lot of experience with people, and so he knows.
Well, wasn't that Cuspit's critique of analysts?
Well, I understand that, but what I'm saying
art
is
and literature.
that it's not local.
I think, Sandy, that there are certain areas that would come up roughly under the heading of applied psychoanalysis, where a psychoanalytic theoretical sensibility meets the sensibilities of people who study the same material from other perspectives. And we can look there at how the two might inform each other, and also of how the psychoanalyst has positioned himself vis-a-vis the professional from another discipline. An area that I'm particularly both interested in and think is illuminating is the area of myths, because myths as the creation of a kind of social unconscious, as an attempt to explain the world, as an attempt to explain the world in the absence of observational data, of very sophisticated observational data about the world, reflects personal understandings and reflects the workings of the unconscious. I think that that's a broadly agreed on idea. You look at the way psychoanalysts look at myths, and they tend to find the psychoanalytic unconscious expressed over and over again. So there's essentially one myth. And if you read Anjou or Ernest Jones or Freud, you know, there's one myth that gets repeated over and over again, and it's essentially the Oedipal story, told again and again and again. People who are professionals in the analysis of myths find many myths and many expressions of unconscious themes that create a much more textured version of what these products of the social unconscious are. Now, how that maps onto the clinical situation, I think we could discuss and debate. But the fact is that it looks to me that we could learn a great deal from this about the unconscious, from the way that people who study things from another perspective look at the same products as we investigate in an applied psychoanalytic context. And the psychoanalytic, you know, the idea that the story of Oedipus has its appeal because Oedipus had an Oedipus complex is something that's widely rejected by people who are the professional students of Oedipus. They don't talk a language of the unconscious when they look at the myth and the tragedy, but they talk about meanings that certainly could coordinate and inform our view of what unconscious processes are all about.
Well, in a way, we've come back to the issue that framed the discussion, which is there are boundary problems in the dialogue amongst the insiders in psychoanalysis, those who've been analyzed and believe. Then several outside communities, the community of sophisticated academics, scientists, or scholars who are not analytically experienced, and the broader general socials community. And psychoanalysis is different from most disciplines in the way that boundary functions. So that there are only, it was said at the beginning, 3 or some odd people in the world who understood general relativity theory. But all the others believed it, not having the vaguest idea what it was. We have an almost opposite arrangement. And it's interesting to think about why it is. One explanation is there's something disturbing. Nobody's really disturbed about general relativity theory. But there's something disturbing about what it is that we claim to have discovered. Another thing is, and this is a methodologic problem for Sandy and particularly maybe Bill's position, almost everyone who looks through a microscope sees bacteria. Almost everyone who looks in a telescope sees stars. But there are a fair number of people who go into analysis who leave it not having found what the analysts say is apparent to anyone who's been analyzed. And it's a tricky argument to say, well, that means they haven't really been analyzed, or it didn't take, because then you're defining the belonging in the community by accepting the conclusions, which is a little troublesome. And there are not too many methods that have that low a take rate on those who use them. So that's a problem for the field. So there are all kinds of things that have made psychoanalysis somewhat different than many other disciplines in the way that there's a failure of communication across that insider rest of the world boundary. And we're talking about various aspects of that.
Yeah, my point was about the attitudes people within other fields take about outsiders. That's what I thought I was saying.
They usually say, use my method and you'll see what I see.
Well, that's basically what the other one is.
But we don't do very well with that.
Well, we don't do well with it because of what, as Roby Bach once said, is euphemistically called the widening scope of psychoanalysis, because it lost the distinction, actually, that Freud adhered to, which was psychoanalysis isn't for everybody. Some people really can't do it.
Then he's close to Jerry's friend. You have to read Aquinas for 10 years.
But let me, well, that may or may not be true, you see, because I think that's a bogus analogy. But apropos of what you say, everyone can look in a telescope and see stars. Everyone can look in a microscope and see bacteria. Well, that's not true in the history of science. When Galileo showed people the stars through his telescope, they really got upset, and they were sure that it was really an effect of the telescope and that there was really nothing like that out there. And in regard to the microscope, that people didn't see a bacteria. In fact, many of them looked in the microscope at sperm and saw homunculi in the sperm. So apparently there's a context of knowledge within which these things we take for granted. You look at a microscope after all those years of medical school, boy, you see a lot of things that if you take somebody else to look at, they're not going to see. And if they see them, they may not know it's bacteria. They may think they're looking at something else. And I think that goes with what that gentleman was saying about the sociology of knowledge, the context and the history of the experience leading up to a particular kind of knowledge. So it's not like studying Thomas Aquinas. It's like having a sense of what the issues were at different times in analysis that required certain concepts and what conditions presently in analysis have led to alteration of those concepts. Does that mean those concepts were wrong? Well, it only, if you listen to current historians of science, whom I believe have been influenced by analysis, they will tell you, don't start doing what they call Whig history of science, where it's all a question of triumphalism, We went from their ignorance to our superior knowledge. Understand the concept by understanding the context. Then, over time, and now. And it seems to me that's a fundamental psychoanalytic attitude which many people have picked up in regard to things like history of science.
Okay.
Psychoanalysis is a victim of its own success.
One last comment from Peter.
We'll want to try to tie these contributions together. You say, Bob, you don't have the kind of evidence that you do with microscopes and telescopes and so on. We've had a request for a definition of science. Now, Freud defined analysis as a special kind of discipline which is only partly science, it's partly humanities. And he understood the problem that we've been addressing. There are no controls. You can tell us what you did with a patient and what the patient said. There are no controls, as there are in bacteriology. Therefore, he very wisely chose to use cultural artifacts. Wrecked by success is the everyday hamburgers of a clinical practice. People aren't as successful as they want to be, and they come, doctor, help me. Why did I screw up in the board meeting, et cetera, et cetera. And he takes a play by Ibsen, and that's something you and I can go check in a library and so on. And when he wants to write about impulse control, which again is everyday psychoanalytic work, or the detail of looking at a very small gesture, you get Michelangelo's Moses. And you can go to the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli and see it, and see whether it makes any sense. I think that's one of the advantages of using culture, and that's why he used Shakespeare and so on.
Thank you.